Hey guys, before we dive into the flickering firelight of history, let's do something simple. Just close your eyes for a second, unless you're driving, then maybe don't. Now, picture winter. Not the kind you handle with a warm hoodie and a coffee run. No, this is real winter. The kind that creeps under your skin and whispers, "You won't make it." The kind where your breath freezes in the air before you finish your sentence. Now imagine facing that, with a house made of mud and sticks. No socks. No fireplace. No doors that seal shut. Just you, your family, and a cold that doesn't care whether you prayed this morning. That's the world medieval peasants lived in. We love stories about kings and castles, but what about the people with dirt under their fingernails and frozen hay in their beds? The ones history forgets, even though they did the hardest living. For them, winter wasn't a season. It was a test. One that came every year without mercy, like a schoolteacher who never gave you a break and never forgot to assign homework. Let's take a walk into that world. The home you live in. Not really a home, more like a sad shelter. Picture a single room, barely tall enough to stand upright. The walls are made of a wattle and daub mix, sticks, mud, straw, and, yes, sometimes cow dung. Not because it's cute, but because dung was sticky, cheap, and, in its own gross way, kind of insulating. Charming, right? It gets better. There's no glass on the windows, if you even have a window. Maybe you've got a hole in the wall covered with animal hide, stiff as cardboard in the cold. The floor. Dirt. Not rustic farmhouse aesthetic dirt. Actual ground that turns into swamp mud every time it snows or rains. Every crack in the wall is an invitation for wind to visit. And trust me, the wind always RSVPs yes. It howls through the gaps like a banshee in a bad mood. Your roof. Thatched. Which means it leaks. It also sags. And if you're lucky, a raccoon won't fall through it while you're trying to eat dinner. The inside temperature of your home? Probably just slightly warmer than the outside, by maybe 2 degrees. Maybe. Nighttime is the real enemy. Darkness isn't just annoying, it's complete. No glow from the city, no streetlights. Just black. The kind of dark that makes you feel like you've fallen out of existence. You huddle around the fire, if you're lucky enough to have one, but the fire's doing its best with wet wood and smoky logs. It roasts the toes of whoever's closest, but anyone else might as well be sitting outside. Clothing. Ha. You've got a couple tunics made of scratchy wool, maybe a goat-scented cloak if you're lucky. Layering helps, but it's like putting on 3 wet towels and hoping you feel warmer. Spoiler alert, you don't. There's no closet full of fluffy blankets, no drawer of thermal socks. And whatever you wear during the day, you're sleeping in at night. No one's getting changed. You cling to the warmth trapped in your grimy, smoky, grease-stained clothes. Fashion? No thanks. You're dressing for survival. Beds are generous if you call a sack of straw a bed. Maybe you've got some hay. Maybe someone threw some rushes down. If you're really high class, there's a wooden frame holding it up. Most of the time, though, it's just a pile on the floor with whatever rags you can find thrown over the top. Oh, and did I mention the fleas? Because yeah, there are fleas. And lice. And weird bugs that don't even have names but bite anyway. Every night you go to sleep hoping 2 things, that you don't wake up frozen, and that your fire doesn't die while you're dreaming. Because if it does, you're not just cold, you're in real danger. And here's the kicker, matches didn't exist. Reigniting a fire meant flint, steel, kindling, patience, and a lot of muttered curses. That's why families took turns watching the coals through the night, what we might call sleeping in shifts. You stay awake a few hours, poke the fire, try not to let it die, and then you nudge your brother and say, "Your turn." And yes, sometimes you stepped on a chicken while doing it. And speaking of chickens, welcome to the medieval peasant sleepover. Because on top of your kids and your grandparents and your very tired spouse, you're also sharing the room with livestock. Cows, goats, pigs, anything that breathes and gives off heat. Your goat might be snuggled up beside you. Your chickens might be nesting in the rafters. That pig in the corner. He doesn't care that it's your birthday, he's claiming his spot near the fire. The smell is incredible. Let's just say, pungent is an understatement. But nobody cares. Warmth, aroma. And besides, your nose is probably numb anyway. And through all of this, through the cold, the mud, the fleas, and the smoke, something extraordinary happened. People survived. Not all, not always. But enough. Enough to carry on. Enough to raise kids and teach them how to seal cracks in the wall with moss. Enough to pass on fire banking techniques like sacred family traditions. Enough to get through one more night, one more storm, one more brutal winter. And that's where this story really begins, not with castles or kings, but with a woman kneeling by the fire at 2 a.m., stirring embers with a stick and whispering a prayer that her baby makes it to spring. Because medieval winter wasn't just about the weather. It was about endurance. And this? This was just the first night. Let's talk about home. When we think of shelter today, we picture 4 solid walls, maybe a thermostat, a roof that keeps the rain out, and windows that you can actually see through. Now, scrap all of that. In medieval peasant life, the concept of home sweet home was less about comfort and more about, does it keep the cows in and most of the wind out? The typical medieval peasant house wasn't so much a house as it was a handmade shrug at the weather. The walls were constructed from what's called wattle and daub, which sounds quaint, until you realize that it's basically sticks smeared with mud, straw, and animal dung. That's right, cow poop. Why? Because dung was sticky. It was free. And when mixed with straw, it made a decently dense wall that could at least try to slow the wind down as it came barreling through the countryside. Now imagine you've built your entire house out of this. Not a room. Not a shed. Your entire house. And this thing, your great fortress against the cold, is about as windproof as a basket full of holes. Winter didn't politely knock on the door. It just barged in. Gaps between the sticks let icy drafts slice through your home like invisible knives. The mud would crack and crumble as the temperature dropped, creating new holes that let the wind dance in and out like it paid rent. You'd wake up some mornings with a dusting of snow on the inside of your home and think, well, at least it's scenic. Windows were almost non-existent. Glass was so expensive it was basically a royal flex, something only the lord of the manor might afford in tiny slivers. For peasants, a window was more like a hole covered with an oiled animal hide or wooden shutters that creaked every time the wind whispered. Natural light was a luxury. Most homes were lit by the fire in the hearth, or a sliver of sun sneaking through a poorly patched wall. And then there were the roofs. If you've ever admired a thatched cottage in some countryside painting, let me stop you right there. In real life, thatch was a nightmare. Sure, it looked rustic and charming, until it rained for 3 days straight and your ceiling started dripping like a sponge with a grudge. Thatch roofs sagged under heavy snow, turned moldy with rain, and, worst of all, let in all kinds of unexpected guests. Birds, mice, insects, sometimes even a squirrel or two. Nothing says cozy like a squirrel falling into your soup. The cold didn't come from just above or outside, it came from beneath too. Most peasant homes had dirt floors, and I don't mean unfinished hardwood. I mean dirt. Packed earth that soaked up the cold like a sponge and released it into your bones. There were no floorboards to keep you raised. No insulation. You could layer straw on top, but it only did so much. When the ground froze, the floor of your home turned into a giant, solid ice pack that you couldn't escape. It was like living on top of a frozen swamp. And the smell. Oh, the smell. Between the damp thatch, the earthy walls, and whatever livestock happened to be living inside with you, medieval homes had what you might call a natural aroma. It was a bouquet of mildew, smoke, old straw, and whatever your goat stepped in. But nobody noticed after a while. Not because the smell faded, because your nose gave up. To keep the cold out, peasants used every trick they could. Moss was stuffed into gaps between the sticks. Old rags, straw, dried grass, and even animal hair were jammed into the cracks. It was a kind of insulation by desperation. Some people would even slap extra layers of mud and dung over the walls every winter, like giving the house a sad little spot treatment just to get through one more season. Still, no matter how many layers you patched on, the wind always found a way. It was relentless. Just when you thought you'd sealed every crack, a fresh breeze would sneak through a new one, finding your ankles like a cold-blooded assassin. And then it rained. Or snowed. Or, worst of all, thawed and froze again. Water seeped through the roof, down the walls, and up from the ground. There was no drainage system. No dry corners. Every step squelched. You weren't just cold. You were cold and damp, wrapped in itchy wool and hoping that nothing important grew mold overnight. Let's not forget, you were sharing all this with your entire family. Parents, kids, grandparents, sometimes neighbors. Maybe even the village goat. There was no such thing as privacy. Everyone huddled into one smoky, musty, freezing room and called it home. And somehow, they made it work. They learned where to sit to avoid the worst drips. They stuffed extra straw in the kids' bedding. They built fires and banked the embers. They told stories to distract from the wind and sang songs to outhowl the storm. They fixed their homes with whatever they could find, old cloaks, bits of rope, sheep grease, even dreams. Anything to hold back the cold a little longer. Was it comfortable? Not even close. Was it livable? Barely. But for medieval peasants, a drafty, leaking, smoke-filled hut was still better than the alternative, sleeping outside. Because at the end of the day, no matter how terrible that house was, it was shelter. It was a place to survive. And in a world where winter was always waiting to take someone, that meant everything. In a medieval peasant's home, there was one thing that stood between you and the cold breath of death, the fire. Not a fireplace, not a cozy brick hearth with a mantle full of knickknacks. Just a fire, raw, smoky, temperamental. It wasn't for ambience. It was survival. The fire was the heart of the house, even if that house was crumbling at the corners. Everything revolved around it. It cooked your food, gave you light, kept the shadows away, and most importantly, it gave warmth, the rarest and most precious currency in winter. But keeping that fire alive? That was a full-time job. Unlike today, there were no matches, no lighters, no stove with a click-click whoosh. If your fire died out, you didn't just start a new one. You prayed. You begged the coals to spark. You got down on your knees with a piece of flint and steel and hoped your frozen fingers were still steady enough to strike. Lighting a fire from scratch was not just difficult, it was potentially deadly. If you failed, your entire family could freeze before dawn. That's why letting the fire go out wasn't just careless. It was dangerous. Irresponsible. Borderline criminal. So, peasants developed a system. A sacred ritual. Before going to sleep, someone in the family, usually the one who'd drawn the short straw, would bank the fire. That meant covering the glowing embers with a thick layer of ash. The ash worked like a blanket, insulating the heat, hiding the glow, and keeping the coals alive until morning. If you did it right, you could poke the pile at sunrise, toss on some twigs, and boom, instant warmth. But if you did it wrong, you were back to flint, steel, and hope. Fire banking was an art. A passed-down skill. Everyone had an opinion. Some said to use dry ash only. Others swore a little dampness helped it last longer. Some packed it down tight. Others let it breathe. Villages had arguments over fire banking techniques the way we debate whether pineapple belongs on pizza. But ash wasn't always enough. Sometimes a gust of wind would sneak through a wall crack and snuff out the embers like blowing out a candle. Sometimes a sheep, yes, a sheep, would stumble too close and scatter the coals. And then there were the nights when the fire just gave up, no matter what you did. Maybe the wood was too wet. Maybe the gods were grumpy. Either way, when the fire died, you felt it immediately. The room got quiet. The shadows thickened. The cold rushed in like it had been waiting at the door all along. To avoid disaster, families took turns through the night, checking the fire. That's right, shift work. Medieval style. Someone always had to be awake, adding fuel, rearranging logs, poking at the embers with a stick. There was no snooze button. No backup system. You fell asleep knowing your brother would wake you in a few hours with a sharp elbow to the ribs and a grumble, "It's your turn." And then there was the smoke. You'd think with all this effort to keep a fire going, people would have nice chimneys to vent the smoke. They didn't. Most peasant homes didn't have chimneys at all. The smoke just filled the room. It curled along the ceiling, snuck into your eyes, clung to your clothes. Eventually, it found its way out through cracks in the roof or tiny holes in the walls. Until then, you breathed it in. Constantly. But weirdly enough, that smoke helped. It kept fleas and bugs away. It acted like medieval bug spray, if bug spray made your eyes water and left you coughing. It also dried the thatch roof, prevented mold, and added just enough haze to make your drafty, freezing house feel like a spooky sauna. The fire wasn't just a heat source. It was also the television. The gathering spot. The storytelling corner. Families would sit around it in the evening, warming their hands, sharing gossip, singing, mumbling prayers. The fire was company. It was comfort. It was the only moving, glowing, hopeful thing in a room full of cold and shadow. But make no mistake, it was work. Finding fuel wasn't easy. Wood wasn't stacked in neat piles out back. Most peasants didn't have access to forests. Trees were valuable resources, often claimed by landlords or kings. Cutting wood without permission could get you fined, or worse. So people got creative. They burned dried sticks, twigs, peat, even dung. Yes, poop. Cow patties, when dried, made excellent fuel. Not exactly fragrant, but when it's you versus the cold, you pick warmth every time. The kids helped too. They were sent out during daylight to gather whatever they could find, fallen branches, old fence posts, anything that could burn. They came back dragging bundles of twigs with numb fingers and red noses, proud to add to the pile. And on really cold nights, when the wind screamed and the walls shook, the fire became something more than fire. It became safety. Protection. Hope. Even the way people slept revolved around it. The elderly and babies slept closest to the hearth. They needed the most warmth. The adults fanned out from there like human insulation. The unlucky ones ended up near the walls, basically the medieval version of sleeping next to an open window in a snowstorm. Sometimes people would wake up with one side of their face warm and the other side frozen. They'd shift positions all night, doing an awkward, half-asleep shuffle just to avoid going numb. But if you managed to wake up with the fire still burning and all your fingers and toes intact, that was a win. That was something to celebrate. Because in a world where a single night could mean the difference between life and death, a stubborn little flame in the corner of a freezing room was a miracle. If you lived through a medieval winter, forget everything you know about style. Fashion wasn't a choice. It was a survival strategy. Looking good was a distant fantasy, somewhere far behind, not freezing to death, and keeping your toes attached. Your wardrobe wasn't about color, cut, or trend. It was about layers, thick, itchy, sometimes unwashed layers stacked on top of each other like human lasagna. There was no such thing as thermal underwear or fleece-lined jackets. You made do with what you had. If that meant wearing the same tunic for 6 weeks straight, so be it. And chances are, you did. Because once winter set in, laundry wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Let's start with the basics. Most peasants had only a few pieces of clothing. A linen undershirt if you were lucky. A wool tunic. Maybe an old cloak or shawl passed down from your grandmother. Shoes. If you had them, they were probably leather and falling apart. If not, you wrapped your feet in rags or stuffed straw into crude sandals and hoped for the best. Wool was king. Not because it was soft, it wasn't, but because it was warm. And warmth meant life. Even when damp, wool trapped heat. That's why people wore layer after layer, even if it made them look like lumpy scarecrows. And here's the thing, you didn't wash your clothes often. Not because you were lazy, but because washing meant getting wet. Getting wet meant getting cold. Getting cold meant, well, possibly dying. So you wore your clothes day and night. You slept in them. Worked in them. Ate in them. Sweated in them. And when they got stiff with dirt and grease, you just shrugged and said, more insulation. The outermost layers got the worst of it, mud, soot, manure, whatever the goat dragged in. But even the underlayers weren't exactly pristine. After weeks of wear, everything had that lived-in smell. That smoky, earthy, slightly sour odor that told the world, I haven't done laundry since harvest season. If you were lucky, you had woolen hose to keep your legs warm. They didn't stretch like modern tights. You tied them up with cords or bits of string. They sagged. They bunched. They itched. But they did the job. Over those, you might add a second tunic or a patched-up cloak. And if you were really cold, you might even borrow a blanket and wear it like a cape. Nothing was off-limits if it kept you warm. Hats and hoods were crucial. Most body heat escapes through the head, so peasants wore woolen caps or coifs, tight-fitting head wraps that made everyone look vaguely like medieval lunch ladies. But they worked. Some even wore multiple hoods layered like onion peels. And here's a weird trick, dirt helped. That's right, dirt. As your clothes got grimier, they actually became better at blocking wind. The layers of smoke, sweat, and mud filled in the tiny holes in the fabric. A well-seasoned tunic might not win any beauty contests, but it could keep the chill out better than a freshly laundered one. There was also the matter of body heat, yours and everyone else's. Huddling together was an essential strategy. You didn't sleep alone. You slept beside your spouse, your children, maybe your cousin, and quite possibly a goat. The goal wasn't space, it was shared warmth. The more bodies, the better the insulation. It was like being part of a big, smelly, uncomfortable human blanket. And you didn't just pile on the clothes. You moved differently too. You learned to conserve energy. Every motion had a purpose. No one ran unless it was absolutely necessary. Movements were slow, efficient, designed to keep heat in and avoid accidents. Because if you fell, if you got wet, if you tore a hole in your only cloak, you didn't have a backup. And don't forget, there were no zippers, buttons, or Velcro. Everything was tied, wrapped, pinned, or fastened with strings. Getting dressed and undressed was an ordeal. That's part of why people avoided changing clothes, they just didn't want to deal with it. Kids wore hand-me-downs until they were practically rags. Babies were wrapped in layers of cloth and tucked into bundles like burritos. No one owned spare outfits. You wore what you had, and when it wore out, you patched it. Again. And again. There were moments of creativity, of course. Someone might add embroidery or colorful thread if they had the time and skill. Maybe you had a bright red hood that made you stand out in the village. But for the most part, survival came first. No one judged you for mismatched hose or a tunic stained with something you couldn't identify. In fact, it showed you were still alive. That was the fashion standard: still breathing, still warm. Then you're dressed just fine. And honestly, that rough, layered, patched up look, it told a story. It said, I've seen winter. I've walked through snow with holes in my boots and frost on my eyebrows. I've sat by a dying fire wrapped in a blanket that smelled like goat. And I made it through. So yes, medieval fashion wasn't glamorous. It was itchy, smelly, heavy. But it was real. It was raw. And most of all, it worked. When you live in a world without insulation, central heating, or even solid doors, survival isn't just about brute strength. It's about strategy. It's about creativity. And for medieval peasants, some of the most effective methods for staying alive through brutal winters were, well, kind of weird. Let's start with housemates. And no, I don't mean extended family members. I mean livestock. That's right. In the dead of winter, your house wasn't just home to you, your spouse, and your kids. It was home to your cows, your pigs, your goats, chickens, maybe even the family donkey. If it breathed and gave off heat, it got a spot inside. Why? Simple. Animals are heaters. Fuzzy, slightly smelly, snoring space heaters. A single cow gives off as much heat as a small campfire. Add a few goats, a pig or two, and a flock of chickens, and you've got yourself a full-scale medieval HVAC system. Sure, your house smelled like a barn, but that's because it was one. And honestly, in that kind of cold, nobody cared. You just got used to the clucks, grunts, and the occasional hoof in the ribs at 2 a.m. And sleeping arrangements? You didn't have a cozy bedroom tucked away upstairs. Everyone, people and animals, slept in one room. Often, the livestock even had the warmest corner, since keeping them alive meant milk, meat, and survival. Losing a cow to frost was almost as bad as losing a family member. Sometimes worse. That cow might be your only source of food and income. So yes, you spooned your spouse, and probably also your goat. The human body was a crucial source of heat too. That's why medieval families slept together, huddled close, like puzzle pieces arranged around the fire. Parents would keep children close. Grandparents tucked in beside them. No one had personal space. Warmth came first. Your sibling's elbow in your back. Worth it. Your uncle's snoring. You could deal. The key was staying warm enough to wake up the next day. Even the way people breathed was part of their survival strategy. In freezing temperatures, breathing through your mouth can dry out your throat and lungs, making it harder to stay warm and increasing your chances of illness. So people learned to breathe slowly and deeply through their noses. Not just because it was healthier, but because it helped warm the air before it hit your lungs. Some folks would even wrap scarves or bits of cloth over their faces while they slept to trap warm breath and reduce heat loss. And then there was food, what little of it there was. You didn't eat 3 square meals a day. Often, you were lucky to eat once. Maybe a thin stew with root vegetables and a stale hunk of bread. But eating something warm helped. A hot meal, no matter how humble, gave your body energy and warmth. That's why stews were so popular. Throw everything you've got, carrots, onions, dried peas, maybe a bone, into one pot, let it simmer all day, and hope it stretches long enough to feed everyone. But one of the strangest and most surprising tactics for survival had nothing to do with fire or food, it had to do with stillness. That's right. Staying still was a survival tool. During the coldest nights, movement was the enemy. Moving too much stirred up cold air. It let heat escape from your clothes. So people learned to keep their limbs tucked in. To curl up tight. To stay in one spot as much as possible. Entire families would lie like frozen logs, barely shifting, wrapped in whatever layers they had, conserving every calorie and every breath. Even in the daytime, conserving energy was crucial. People moved with slow, deliberate motions. They didn't waste effort. A trip outside wasn't just a chore, it was a mission. Go too far, stay too long, and you might not come back. So every movement was calculated. Every step outside was a risk. The layout of the home reflected this survival mindset too. The hearth wasn't just where you cooked, it was where you lived. Everything happened within a few feet of the fire. You ate there. Slept nearby. Told stories. Mended clothes. Prayed. You didn't wander off to another room. There was no other room. And finally, there was one more trick, a trick passed down like family treasure. Hot stones. That's right. Peasants would heat stones in the fire, then wrap them in cloth and place them in the bedding. It wasn't much, but a warm stone at your feet could make the difference between a miserable night and a bearable one. It was a mini heater, powered by fire, wrapped in whatever rags you had left. Even the poorest families knew this trick. It didn't require money. Just timing, patience, and a little luck that the stone didn't scorch your blanket. All of these strange, clever, slightly ridiculous methods added up to something incredible: survival. Not comfort. Not luxury. But survival. Because in the depths of winter, with the wind howling and the world frozen solid outside your walls, staying alive was the greatest victory. And if it took snuggling a pig, breathing through a scarf, or sleeping with a hot rock under your feet, so be it. Medieval peasants may not have had much, but they had grit. And they had each other. And in the end, that's what got them through. We've talked about the cold. The cracked walls. The itchy wool. The midnight fire shifts and goats in your bed. And yeah, it sounds miserable. But here's the truth no one tells you: it worked. Not flawlessly. Not comfortably. But enough. Enough for families to hold on. Enough to carry entire villages through winters that were long, brutal, and unforgiving. Every cough, every shared blanket, every log tossed into the fire, it all mattered. These weren't just desperate attempts to get through the night. They were acts of survival. Of quiet resilience. You see, survival wasn't loud in the Middle Ages. It wasn't heroic or flashy. It didn't come with battle cries or grand gestures. It came in soft, everyday choices: staying close, staying still, sharing warmth, trusting in the routines passed down through generations. There's something deeply powerful in that kind of strength, the kind that doesn't shout. The kind that simply endures. And that endurance, that spirit, it left a mark. It's easy to forget about the peasants in history. They didn't build cathedrals or write books. They didn't wear crowns or sit on thrones. But they kept the world going. They were the ones who plowed the fields, raised the children, chopped the wood, and made sure that somehow, through bitter winters and impossible odds, life continued. They didn't do it with comfort. They did it with grit. Think about it: if you're alive today, there's a good chance someone in your bloodline once crouched by a dying fire, clutching a wool blanket, praying for morning. Someone once stuffed moss into the wall cracks, wrapped their baby in rags, and curled up beside a cow just to get through one more night. And they did it. They made it through. That's not just history. That's legacy. A legacy written not in stone monuments or epic poems, but in stubborn hope. In warm breath against the cold. In hands calloused from chopping firewood and arms sore from holding loved ones close. This isn't the kind of history we usually teach. It doesn't have kings or dates or famous battles. But it's real. And honestly, it's more relatable than most. Because no matter where you're from or what century you live in, everyone knows what it feels like to endure something hard. To feel like the odds are stacked against you. To be tired, cold, stretched thin, and still get up the next day and try again. That's what those winters were. That's what those people did. And that's why their story still matters. It reminds us that resilience doesn't always look strong. Sometimes, it looks like a smoke-stained tunic and frostbitten toes. Sometimes, it looks like a child whispering a bedtime prayer while curled up between their grandparents. Sometimes, it's just the soft, steady breathing of a family that made it through another night. So tonight, as you crawl into a warm bed with clean sheets and a roof that doesn't leak, spare a thought for the ones who came before you. The quiet heroes. The invisible warriors. The survivors. They didn't have much. But they had heart. They had fire. And in the end, that was enough. Next is the story of Anne Boleyn, the fateful queen. Before the throne, before the crown, before the scandal that would shake an entire kingdom, there was just Anne. A clever girl. A charming girl. A girl who, at first glance, didn't seem destined for history books. But fate had other plans. Anne Boleyn didn't grow up with royal blood in her veins. She wasn't a princess. She wasn't born in a castle. She was the daughter of a diplomat, raised in the English countryside, sent away as a teenager to serve at European courts. And that's where everything began to shift. While other girls were learning how to curtsy and smile on command, Anne was watching, listening, absorbing. She spent her teenage years in the heart of European culture, in the Netherlands and France, where court life was more than just silk gowns and polite conversation. It was politics, seduction, power games. And wasn't just pretty. She was sharp. She learned how to speak French fluently. She learned wit, confidence, and how to stand out in a room full of nobility without a title to her name. When she returned to England, she didn't come back as some shy country girl. She walked into court like she belonged there. She had style, she had spark, and she had something no one could quite describe. Some said she was too bold, too outspoken. But King Henry VIII? He saw something else. Something magnetic. Now, Henry wasn't exactly known for loyalty. He was a king, after all. Married to Queen Catherine of Aragon, but no stranger to mistresses. Anne's own sister had already been one of them. So when Henry turned his eye toward Anne, everyone assumed it would be the same story, flirtation, a few months of attention, and then goodbye. But Anne had no intention of playing that role. She didn't want to be his mistress. She wanted more. And for the first time in his life, Henry met a woman who said no repeatedly. Politely, cleverly, but firmly. And drew a line. If Henry wanted her, he'd have to make her queen. It sounds outrageous. Even dangerous. But somehow, it worked. Because the more Anne said no, the more Henry said yes. Yes to pursuing her. Yes to ignoring his counselors. Yes to challenging the Pope. Yes to breaking from the Catholic Church entirely. That's right, one woman's refusal sparked a religious and political revolution. And wasn't just rising, she was rewriting the rules. Of course, not everyone was cheering her on. Court gossip swirled. Nobles whispered behind fans. People called her a temptress, a witch, an ambitious schemer. Some hated her before she even wore the crown. But Anne wasn't fazed. She played the court game like a master, knowing full well that power doesn't come without enemies. Still, behind the sharp wit and fearless gaze was a woman who knew how high the stakes were. Saying no to a king could cost you your life. But saying yes too soon could cost you everything you ever dreamed of. So Anne walked the tightrope. Carefully. Brilliantly. And with just enough fire to keep Henry completely hooked. And then came the moment everything changed. Anne was pregnant. For Henry, this was a sign. A promise. The son he desperately wanted could finally be born. And with that, he pushed forward, harder than ever. The marriage to Catherine was declared invalid. Henry defied the Pope. He declared himself head of the Church of England. And Anne Boleyn, this girl from the English countryside, was crowned queen. It was a moment of triumph. A royal love story unlike anything England had ever seen. But as we'll learn soon, it was also the beginning of the end. Becoming queen was never the finish line, it was just the beginning. For Anne Boleyn, the crown came with more than jewels. It came with enemies. Expectations. Pressure. 1,000 eyes watching her every move. One wrong step, and the court that once whispered her name with envy would turn on her like wolves. At first, there was hope. There was celebration. The marriage to Henry was bold, controversial, and completely unprecedented, but Anne had won. She had made history. She was Queen of England. And then, she gave birth. But not to the long-awaited son. And gave birth to a daughter. Elizabeth. It wasn't what Henry had hoped for. He needed a male heir. A king in waiting. A symbol of strength and continuity. And while Anne's daughter would one day become one of the greatest monarchs England had ever known, no one could see that in the cradle. Not yet. Not then. To the court, the baby's gender wasn't just a disappointment, it was a problem. And for Anne, the pressure doubled. She became consumed by the need to produce a son. Every moment of her reign was shadowed by expectation. And in the eyes of Henry, who had risked everything to be with her, Anne's worth became tied to her ability to deliver that one thing he didn't yet have. She tried again. And again. Pregnancies that ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, heartbreak. And with every loss, the whispers grew louder. She's cursed. She's too ambitious. She bewitched the king. The court that once buzzed with her name now hissed behind closed doors. And Henry, once smitten, once obsessed, began to look elsewhere. Enter Jane Seymour. Quiet, modest, obedient. The complete opposite of Anne in every way. Suddenly, Anne's confidence wasn't charming, it was grating. Her sharp tongue wasn't clever, it was dangerous. Her presence, once magnetic, now felt like a threat. The court began to shift. Loyalties wavered. Anne felt the ground beneath her start to crack. But she wasn't going down without a fight. And doubled down. She argued. She pleaded. She pushed Henry to defend her, to protect the future they had risked everything to build. She reminded him of their love, their promises, the fire that once burned between them. But love is fragile in the halls of power. And Henry's heart was drifting. Still, and remained queen. She still wore the crown. She still had supporters. And then, one day, she overheard a conversation. A casual remark. An offhand comment. And the walls started closing in. Because in a royal court, words are weapons. Anne was accused of adultery. Not just once, but with multiple men. Some of them her closest allies. Even her own brother. The charges were outrageous, scandalous, and impossible to prove. But proof wasn't the point. This wasn't about justice. It was about removal. Anne was too powerful, too dangerous, too unpredictable. She had changed the course of English history, but now, she was in the way. So the same court that once celebrated her rise now prepared for her fall. Anne was arrested, dragged from her chambers, and thrown into the Tower of London. She denied everything. Spoke with dignity. Refused to confess to crimes she didn't commit. But the trial was never going to be fair. The verdict had already been decided. And through it all, Anne held her head high. She who had once made a king bend to her will now stood surrounded by lies and betrayal. But she didn't beg. She didn't break. Because even in the face of ruin, Anne Boleyn knew exactly who she was. A queen. The Tower of London was cold. Stone walls. Iron gates. Shadows that clung to the corners like secrets. This was where Anne Boleyn waited, no longer Queen of England, but a prisoner. Stripped of her titles. Separated from her daughter. Surrounded not by courtiers and musicians, but guards and whispers. And she knew exactly what was coming. And wasn't naive. She had spent years watching the games of power unfold. She had played them herself, boldly, brilliantly. But now, the board had shifted. The players had changed. And she was no longer holding the cards. Still, she held her head high. Because even as they prepared her trial, and knew the truth, this wasn't about justice. It was about control. About making an example. About wiping her from the story Henry wanted to rewrite. And so, the trial began. And was charged with adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Her lovers included poets, nobles, servants, even her own brother, George Bullen. The accusations were explosive. Scandalous. And completely absurd. But that didn't matter. Facts weren't the point. In Tudor England, trials weren't always about guilt. They were about narrative. About power. And Henry needed a clean slate. He needed an out of the picture so he could marry Jane Seymour and move on, without looking like the villain. So they built a case on gossip. On hearsay. On fear. Witnesses testified under pressure. Names were listed. Stories were twisted. And Anne, the woman who once held the heart of the most powerful man in England, now stood in a courtroom filled with eyes that had already judged her. She defended herself with courage. With grace. With clarity. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She spoke clearly, intelligently, reminding the court of her innocence, her loyalty, her love for the king. But the outcome was never in doubt. And was found guilty. All charges. Every one of them. The sentence, death. Execution by beheading. Henry, in a final twisted gesture, ordered a French swordsman, known for his swift, clean strikes, to carry out the sentence. A mercy, they called it. As if killing her with style somehow made it more noble. And had a few short days to wait. Days filled with prayers, with tears, with moments of silence as she stared out the small window of her cell. But she also found strength. She composed herself. She wrote letters. She forgave. She made peace. And then came the morning. May 19, 1536. And dressed with care. She chose a simple grey gown, covered with a crimson robe. She walked to the scaffold with steady steps, surrounded by guards and watched by a silent crowd. And as she climbed the platform, she turned to them, not with fear, but with calm. She gave a short speech. She did not accuse the king. She did not defend herself further. Instead, she asked them to pray for her. She said she hoped God would save the king, that he would rule wisely, that he would continue to prosper. Her words were full of dignity, even grace. And then, with her final breath, Anne Boleyn knelt, laid her neck upon the block, and waited. The swordsman, trained to strike without pause or warning, delivered a single, clean blow. Just like that, England's most controversial queen was gone. But Anne's story didn't end there. Because legacies aren't always about how a life ends. Sometimes, they're about what comes next. And what came next was a daughter named Elizabeth. A child Anne never got to raise. A child many believed was a disappointment. A child who, despite the whispers, the shame, the shadow of her mother's fall, would one day rise to become a queen in her own right. A queen who would reign for over 40 years. A queen who would lead England into its golden age. A queen who would take the name Elizabeth and make it immortal. And never got to see it. Never got to know. But she had planted the seed. She had lit the flame. She had challenged the most powerful man in her world and changed the course of history. She paid the price. But in doing so, she gave England something it didn't yet understand it needed. A future. Anne Boleyn was gone. Her body buried in a quiet chapel. Her name reduced to whispers. Her story, for a while, nearly erased. But history has a funny way of remembering what it wants to forget. Though Anne's life ended on a scaffold, her presence never really disappeared. It lingered in the halls of power, in the uneasy glances of nobles, in the silence between prayers. Because everyone knew, Anne Boleyn had changed everything. She had taken on a king, and won, if only for a time. She had challenged the church, the court, the rules of the game, and rewrote them. And through it all, she had left behind something far more powerful than gossip or scandal. She left behind Elizabeth. At first, no one expected much from the little girl with red hair and her mother's sharp eyes. She was a daughter of controversy. A child born in the middle of political chaos. After Anne's execution, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Her title stripped. Her future uncertain. She was removed from court, tucked away in the countryside, out of sight, out of mind. But like her mother, Elizabeth was a survivor. She grew up watching. Learning. Listening. She learned how power worked not from books, but from watching it destroy the people around her. She learned patience. Strategy. Silence. And she never forgot her mother's fate. Anne's story became a warning, but also a blueprint. It showed Elizabeth what power could give, and what it could take away. And it shaped the queen she would become. Years passed. Kings rose and fell. Elizabeth's half-brother Edward became king, but died young. Then came her half-sister Mary, who ruled with fire and fear, burning anyone who stood in her way. Elizabeth walked carefully. Spoke softly. She stayed alive. And then, in 1558, the impossible happened. Elizabeth became queen. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, once cast aside, once called a bastard, now held the crown her mother had only briefly worn. The court that had condemned and now bowed to her daughter. But Elizabeth didn't rule like Anne. She ruled because of Anne. She understood that power wasn't given, it was taken, guarded, held with both hands. She knew how to charm, when to command, when to be silent, and when to strike. Like her mother, she was intelligent, charismatic, magnetic. But unlike Anne, she had learned how to play the long game. She never married. She trusted few. She turned herself into a symbol, the Virgin Queen. Married to her country, not to any man. It was a shield. A choice. A statement. And through her reign, the memory of Anne Boleyn began to shift. No longer just a scandalous queen. No longer just a tragic woman. And became a mother of a monarch. A woman ahead of her time. A spark that lit a flame. Elizabeth never spoke often about her mother. Not publicly. But she honored her in quiet, deliberate ways. She wore Anne's ring. She kept portraits. She surrounded herself with advisors who had once been loyal to Anne. And when she walked through the Tower of London, the place where her mother had taken her last breath, she did so as queen. As the woman who had survived everything that tried to erase her. The shadow of Anne Boleyn never left England. It shaped it. She had died shamed. Silenced. But her daughter reigned gloriously. And in that reign, Anne's name was reborn. It wasn't redemption through pity. It was redemption through legacy. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't surviving the fall. It's watching your child rise in your place, and rise higher than you ever could. History has a way of coming full circle. Anne Boleyn once dreamed of a future where her child would thrive. She never lived to see it. But what Elizabeth became, what she chose to become, was more than even Anne could have imagined. Elizabeth didn't just sit on the throne. She transformed it. When she took power, England was fragile. torn apart by years of religious war, mistrust, executions, and fear. The people were exhausted. The court was unstable. And few believed that a young, unmarried woman could rule a divided nation. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She didn't try to be someone else. She led with clarity, confidence, cunning. And slowly, steadily, she turned doubt into loyalty, chaos into order. She re-established the Church of England, not as a pawn of Rome or a weapon of vengeance, but as a symbol of balance. She brokered peace without surrendering strength. She spoke to her people not just from the throne, but from horseback, in armor, on battlefields. She was regal, but real. Stern, but deeply human. And the people noticed. They didn't just obey Elizabeth, they believed in her. Her speeches moved armies. Her presence calmed riots. Her image was everywhere, on coins, portraits, even in poems. She became not just a ruler, but a myth. Gloriana. The Virgin Queen. Good Queen Bess. Names layered with admiration, reverence, and something close to love. And through it all, Anne's ghost lingered. In Elizabeth's education, shaped by the finest tutors in Europe. In her political instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of watching others fall. In the way she never married, never shared her throne, just as her mother once refused to settle for anything less than a crown. Elizabeth's court became a center of art, music, poetry, and drama. Shakespeare flourished under her reign. Trade expanded. Exploration reached new worlds. England, once viewed as a backwater island, became a rising power on the world stage. But the crown weighed heavily. There were plots. Assassins. Betrayals. Some tried to marry her off. Some tried to kill her. Every decision came with risk. Every friendship with suspicion. And yet, she endured. Like Anne had endured before her. Different methods. Same fire. And perhaps that's the real legacy. Not the gold. Not the victories. Not the titles. But the unshakable will to lead, to fight, to survive in a world designed to silence women. And Boleyn didn't live to see her daughter's reign. She never heard the cheers of Elizabeth's coronation. Never read the poems written in her honor. Never saw her child ride at the front of an army or stand defiant before a foreign ambassador. But she gave her the tools. She gave her the name. The eyes. The strength. The scars. She gave her the story that would haunt her, and shape her. Because you don't become Queen of England by accident. You become queen because someone before you dared to imagine it. And Boleyn dared. And Elizabeth delivered. So when we speak of Anne Boleyn now, it's not just as a scandal, a mistress, a doomed queen. We speak of her as the mother of a dynasty. A woman who lost everything, but gave birth to a woman who would become everything. That's not tragedy. That's legacy. All stories end, even the ones that reshape history. Elizabeth I had ruled for more than 4 decades. She had outlived her rivals, outlasted her enemies, and outshone almost every monarch who had come before her. But even queens are human. As she aged, the bright flame of her youth softened into a slow-burning glow. Her hair turned thin and white. Her walk slowed. Her body, once firm in armor and purpose, began to ache. The woman who once thundered through battlefields on horseback now leaned on cushions, spoke in whispers, and stared long into the fire. She had no children. No heir. No husband to sit beside her in her final days. She was alone. But not unloved. To many, she was still Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of a nation. A symbol. A myth. A force. But to those closest to her, she was also just Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, in her final days, was tired. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She refused to lie in bed, sitting for hours on cushions in her chamber, silent, unmoving, lost in thought. Some say she saw ghosts. Others say she was waiting, for what, no one knew. But what she had built, remained. A country that had once been torn apart now stood united. An era that had begun with doubt ended in reverence. Elizabeth had left behind no children, but she had left behind something bigger. A legacy. She had ruled as no woman ever had before. With steel and silk. With logic and legend. She had proven that power could wear a crown and a dress, and not bend to any man. She had walked the line between ruler and symbol, between human and myth, and never slipped. And then, in the early hours of March 24, 1603, she slipped away. Quietly. Peacefully. No final speech. No dramatic farewell. Just the closing of eyes that had seen too much. Just the last breath of a queen who had never truly stopped fighting. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath a tomb shared with her half-sister Mary. Above the stone lies a simple inscription. Partners in throne and grave. It was ironic, in a way. Mary, who had tried to destroy Elizabeth's legacy in life, now lay beside her in death. But history had chosen its favorite. Elizabeth's funeral was massive. The streets of London overflowed with mourners. Bells rang across the city. People wept, not just for a monarch, but for the end of an era. The Elizabethan age had closed its final chapter. But it didn't disappear. Because Elizabeth's story had become something larger than a reign. It was a turning point. A template. A testament. To ambition. To resilience. To a woman who rose in the shadow of her mother's fall, and built something no one could take away. And in that final silence, in that last breath, there was something else. Anne. The woman whose head fell beneath a French sword. The woman whose name was once cursed. The woman whose only child became the most celebrated monarch in England's history. And never knew how her story would end. But Elizabeth did. She lived it. She carried it. And when her own story came to a close, it ended not in shame, but in triumph. Because in the end, both women had defied their time. And, by daring to want more. Elizabeth, by becoming more than anyone dared to imagine. And together, even in death, they left behind something that even kings could not erase. A legacy written in fire, in blood, and in the unbreakable will of two women who refused to disappear. Next we come to the story of the Boston Tea Party and the beginning of the American Revolution. By the early 1770s, the American colonies were a pot simmering on high heat. The relationship with Britain, once seen as a proud motherland, had soured into something sharp, bitter, and unrelenting. It didn't start with tea. Years earlier, Parliament had imposed the Stamp Act, a tax on everyday items like newspapers and playing cards. Then came the Townshend Acts, which taxed glass, paper, and paint. Each new law, passed an ocean away by a government where the colonists had no voice, felt like a slap to the face. At first, the colonies resisted with words, petitions, boycotts, and newspaper essays. Intellectuals like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson wrote passionately about liberty, rights, and the dangers of unchecked power. Ordinary people, from merchants to blacksmiths, joined the growing chorus of protest. But the British response was cold, dismissive, and often violent. The 1770 Boston Massacre left blood on the cobblestones and a scar on the colonial psyche. Trust evaporated. The more the British tightened their grip, the more the colonies bristled. There was no denying it anymore, this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was oppression. Then came the Tea Act of 1773. On the surface, it seemed like a gift. Parliament allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out middlemen and slashing prices. The tea would be cheaper than ever. But the colonists weren't fooled. The act kept the existing tax in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without representation. And that, to the colonists, was betrayal. A bargain wrapped in chains. Across the colonies, the response was swift and sharp. In Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York, resistance groups blocked the tea ships. In many ports, the ships simply turned back. But in Boston, the ships stayed. 3 vessels, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor and refused to leave. British law stated that if the tea wasn't unloaded within 20 days, customs officials could seize it, and troops could be called in to enforce payment. The governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, stood firm. He refused to let the ships leave. The tea would be unloaded, and the tax would be paid, no exceptions. Boston exploded with tension. The Sons of Liberty, a network of fiery patriots, sprang into action. Public notices were posted urging citizens to reject the tea. Mass meetings were held in taverns, churches, and town squares. The Old South Meeting House became the heartbeat of the rebellion, its wooden walls shaking from the roars of angry voices. Thousands crammed inside, with more overflowing into the streets. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with artisans and lawyers. Women passed petitions. Young boys handed out leaflets. This wasn't just political anymore, it was personal. The tea wasn't just tea. It was a test. Accept it, and you bow to tyranny. Reject it, and you declare your right to resist. Each day the ship sat in the harbor, the pressure grew. It was like watching a lit fuse inching toward an explosion. As the final deadline approached, Governor Hutchinson doubled down. He believed giving in would mean surrendering to mob rule. To him, order meant obedience, even if it meant force. He was willing to call in troops. He was willing to see blood. And still, the colonists held the line. They knew what was coming. Everyone did. You could feel it in the air, the thick, breathless tension that settles over a city before a storm. Boston was a match waiting to be struck. And somewhere in the crowd, in the flicker of candlelight and clenched fists, a decision was being made. Not with permission. Not with debate. But with resolve. December 16, 1773 dawned cold and gray over Boston. The city stood on edge, like a candle flickering before the wind. For nearly 3 weeks, the 3 tea ships had sat in the harbor like time bombs ticking louder with each passing day. And now, the final deadline had come. British law demanded the tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If it wasn't, customs officers could seize the cargo, and the army could intervene. Everyone in Boston knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea was brought ashore, the colonies would have surrendered, not just their goods, but their principles. If they allowed this tax to pass, even once, it would mean admitting they were mere subjects, not citizens. That morning, thousands of colonists poured into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in Boston. Some had walked for hours through snow and sleet to be there. The air inside was thick with breath and tension. Samuel Adams, the voice of rebellion, presided. Speaker after speaker rose, denouncing the Tea Act, condemning British tyranny, urging action. But even as the crowd roared with defiance, a deep unease lingered. What could they do without starting a war? How could they stop the tea without inviting bloodshed? Then came news: Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to back down. The ships would not be released. The tea would be seized. The tax would be enforced. The meeting hall buzzed with fury. Feet stamped. Voices rose. And then, Samuel Adams stood. His voice calm but heavy. "This meeting," he said, "can do nothing more to save the country." Just one sentence. But everyone in the room understood its meaning. No more speeches. No more debates. No more waiting. It was time to act. Suddenly, a loud war whoop pierced the air outside. It echoed through the halls, sharp and unmistakable. It was the signal. A plan that had lived in whispers was now moving into the light. Men slipped out into the cold evening, wiping soot on their faces, pulling blankets around their shoulders, adorning themselves with feathers. They weren't trying to fool anyone, they weren't pretending to be real Mohawk warriors. This was a statement. A symbol. They had shed their identities as British subjects. Tonight, they were something else. Free men. They moved through the dark streets in silence. No shouting. No chaos. Just determination. By the dozens, they converged on Griffin's Wharf, where the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver lay at anchor. The air was sharp with salt and frost. The harbor water churned black beneath the ships, biting with cold. Boarding the vessels swiftly, they found only a few crew members aboard. The sailors were pushed aside, not harmed, just removed. The mission was clear: destroy the tea. Nothing else. Hatchets and clubs came down on the crates with practiced swings. Wooden chests split open. The sharp scent of fresh tea filled the night air. Men worked fast and without words, throwing crate after crate into the icy harbor. 1. 10. 100. More. Splash after splash echoed across the still water, 342 crates in total. Thousands of pounds of tea, gone. On the docks, spectators watched in stunned silence. No one cheered. No one looted. There was no drunken frenzy, no wild celebration. This wasn't a riot. It was an act of precision. An act of protest. Even British guards nearby did nothing. Maybe they were confused. Maybe they sympathized. Maybe they just understood, something irreversible was happening. And it wasn't just about tea anymore. The discipline was remarkable. Nothing was stolen. No damage was done to the ships. The men could have easily taken goods, coins, anything of value. But they didn't. Their target was clear. Not the merchants. Not the sailors. Only the symbol of oppression, British tea. By midnight, it was over. The harbor churned with soggy tea leaves and broken chests. And Boston was no longer the same. That night, without bloodshed or bullets, a message had been sent. One louder than any cannon. One clearer than any royal decree. The colonies would not be silenced. They would not be bought. And they would not bow. The morning after the Boston Tea Party, Boston Harbor looked like a battlefield. But there were no corpses, no fire, no gunshots, only crates, shattered wood, and tea leaves swirling like ashes on black water. Word of what happened spread faster than anyone expected. It wasn't just a local protest, it was a spark. A message. And that message traveled fast. Across the 13 colonies, reactions varied, but most shared one thing: awe. In towns from New Hampshire to Georgia, people read about the destruction of 342 chests of tea and gasped. Not at the violence, because there was none, but at the courage. The sheer audacity. No one had died. No one had looted. No one had set a building on fire. This wasn't a riot, it was a warning. For the British Empire, it was an insult. A slap in the face from a colony they considered loyal. When word reached London, Parliament erupted in fury. Tea wasn't just a product, it was power. And power had been thrown into the sea by people they saw as ungrateful rebels. To British officials, this wasn't protest. It was rebellion. Prime Minister Lord North didn't hesitate. He vowed to make an example of Boston. Parliament passed what became known in America as the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they called them the Coercive Acts. Different names, but the goal was the same: crush the resistance. The port of Boston. Shut down. No trade. No supplies. British troops. Increased. Courts. Taken over. Self-governance. Stripped. To many colonists, it felt like collective punishment. And suddenly, even those who had once stayed neutral began to reconsider. Because if Parliament could punish an entire city for one night of protest, what else might they do? The Boston Tea Party became more than a moment, it became a symbol. In taverns and churches, people retold the story with reverence. In newspapers, essays poured in defending the patriots. In towns that once feared confrontation, citizens now gathered, formed militias, and pledged support. And for the British, the problem was growing. Every punishment they handed down only created more unity among the colonies. What was once Boston's defiance was now becoming America's. The colonies formed committees of correspondence, sharing news, ideas, and warnings. Across the countryside, blacksmiths sharpened blades, guns were cleaned, and powder was stored. Everyone sensed what was coming. The fuse had been lit. But beyond the colonies and the crown, others watched, too. In Europe, kings and ministers followed the events closely. Some mocked the British for losing control. Others feared that rebellion might spread. A colony daring to defy its empire, it was both a cautionary tale and a beacon. And for those in the colonies, something fundamental had changed. Before the Tea Party, many still hoped for reconciliation. They wanted rights, not war. Representation, not revolution. But the intolerable acts changed the tone. They were a message: you don't get to question us. The colonists had an answer: then we won't be ruled by you. In Philadelphia, leaders called for a Continental Congress. Delegates from across the colonies would meet, debate, and decide, together. It was the first step toward something that had once seemed unthinkable: unity. The Boston Tea Party had not only shattered crates of tea. It had shattered the illusion that the colonies were still British at heart. From that night on, they began to see themselves as something else. As Americans. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, it didn't just make headlines, it set the British Empire on fire. Parliament was stunned, then furious. Tea, millions of pounds of it, had been dumped into the sea. Not stolen. Not taxed. Simply destroyed. That wasn't just protest. That was defiance. And defiance, in the eyes of the Empire, had to be crushed. Within weeks, British officials moved swiftly to punish Boston. What followed were the coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, a name that stuck because it was true. First, they shut down Boston's port. No ships in. No ships out. Trade, the lifeblood of the city, choked off. Merchants collapsed. Workers were left idle. Families suffered. Next, Parliament stripped Massachusetts of its right to self-govern. Town meetings were banned. Officials would now be appointed by the Crown, not elected. British troops were given broader powers to occupy homes and patrol the streets. To the British, this was justice. To the colonists, it was tyranny. The backlash was immediate and widespread. Far from isolating Boston, the crackdown united the colonies. From New York to the Carolinas, people rallied. Supplies were sent to Boston. Towns held public fasts and prayer vigils. In Virginia, even George Washington, once hesitant about open rebellion, called the punishment the cause of all America. The Tea Party had started as a local protest. Now it was becoming a national awakening. In Philadelphia, leaders proposed something radical: a Continental Congress. Representatives from every colony would gather to decide what to do next. It was the first real step toward unity, a step that had once seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Boston was under siege, not by cannons, but by hunger and British law. But the people didn't fold. They adapted. Secret networks smuggled food and information past blockades. Pamphlets circulated like wildfire, inspiring others to stand firm. Taverns became centers of strategy. Churches rang their bells not just for worship, but for warning. And in the fields and forests beyond the cities, something else stirred. Militias. Ordinary men began training with muskets and powder. Blacksmiths worked long hours forging bayonets. Farmers learned formations. Young boys carried messages between towns like nervous couriers of a growing resistance. The colonies were not preparing for talks anymore. They were preparing for war. In London, King George III was unyielding. To him, the colonies had become unruly children. And children must be punished. He ordered more troops to Boston. More ships. More force. But he miscalculated. He thought the colonies would back down. Instead, they doubled down. By 1774, Boston wasn't just a rebellious city, it was the symbol of a people who had found their voice. Even as British redcoats marched through its streets, even as leaders like Samuel Adams were branded traitors, the colonists refused to bend. In fact, they bent something else entirely, the course of history. They had no formal army. No navy. No treasury. But they had resolve. And that resolve spread like thunder rolling down the 13 colonies. The Boston Tea Party was over. But the revolution it inspired was only beginning. The Boston Tea Party was over. The crates had sunk. The harbor reeked of rebellion. But the most important thing wasn't what went into the water. It was what came out of it, a new sense of identity. That night in Boston didn't just mark the destruction of tea. It marked the transformation of a people. Before, the colonists were British subjects who grumbled about unfair taxes. After, they were something else entirely, Americans with a cause, a voice, and, perhaps most dangerous of all, conviction. The British saw it differently. To them, it was vandalism. A tantrum by spoiled colonies. And they responded with fury. Troops filled the streets. Ships blocked the ports. The noose tightened. But instead of silence, what they heard was something they hadn't expected: solidarity. From the Carolinas to Connecticut, the colonies began to move as one. They sent food, firewood, money. They sent letters of support. In towns and cities, men gathered in secret, lit candles, and passed along messages whispered through walls: Boston stands, and so will we. Newspapers published poems and essays praising the patriots. Ministers preached from pulpits about moral duty and righteous defiance. The message was simple and powerful: tyranny must not win. But the movement needed direction. Action. So, in September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. It was the First Continental Congress, a group of farmers, lawyers, merchants, and soldiers, sitting together not as scattered voices, but as a united front. They didn't call for independence, not yet. But they did something just as bold: they agreed to resist. To boycott British goods. To prepare militias. To stand by Massachusetts. The Boston Tea Party had started the fire. The intolerable acts had added fuel. Now, the flames spread fast. Still, many hoped for peace. Letters were sent to King George III, pleading for understanding, for compromise, for reason. But the king refused to listen. He believed the colonies could be broken. That enough pressure, enough punishment, would force obedience. He couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of submission, he got Lexington and Concord. He got Bunker Hill. He got the Declaration of Independence. But all of that, every battle, every word, every dream, traces back to that night in Boston. That moment when ordinary people did something extraordinary. They didn't fire a shot. They didn't carry a flag. They didn't know what the future would hold. They just knew, something had to change. And they were willing to be the ones who changed it. The Boston Tea Party proved something that words alone never could. That the people were ready. Ready to sacrifice. ready to fight. Ready to become something new. Not British. Not rebels. But a nation. The night the tea fell into Boston Harbor, no one truly knew what they had begun. To the British Empire, it was an act of treason. To the merchants, it was economic suicide. To the frightened loyalists, it was madness. But to the men and women who stood on the dock that night, watching the crates vanish beneath the water, it was something more. It was the beginning of a transformation that would ripple far beyond Boston, far beyond even America. The Boston Tea Party was never just about tea. It was about voice. It was about dignity. It was about the right to say, no. Centuries later, the act still burns with symbolic power. Schools teach it. Monuments mark it. Politicians invoke it. The image of patriots disguised in feathers, dumping tea into the cold December waters, is one of the most enduring snapshots in American identity. But why? Why does that moment matter so much? Because it wasn't led by generals or kings. It wasn't ordered by a government or funded by a foreign power. It was ordinary people. Shopkeepers. Blacksmiths. Teachers. Farmers. People who had no guarantee of success. People who risked everything not for riches, but for principle. And in doing so, they rewrote the script of what resistance could look like. Around the world, oppressed people would look to that moment and see a model. That a protest didn't need to be loud to be heard. That a single act of defiance, executed with unity and clarity, could awaken a continent. In India, during Gandhi's Salt March. In South Africa, against apartheid. In Ukraine's Maidan, in Hong Kong's umbrellas, echoes of that night in Boston linger. But the legacy of the Tea Party is not just about the act itself. It's about what came after. The courage to keep going when retaliation followed. The wisdom to gather, debate, and build a better system. The belief that freedom was worth more than fear. In the years that followed, America would stumble. There would be hypocrisy, injustice, and divisions that cut deep. But time and again, when Americans returned to their roots, they found themselves back at that harbor, back with those crates, back with that choice. To resist. To stand. To believe in something better. It was never about tea. It was always about the people willing to tip the balance. And those people, disguised, determined, drenched in courage, changed the world. Next we come to the last story today, the forgotten civilization, Caral in Peru. Long before pyramids rose in Egypt, before the first stone temples appeared in Mesopotamia, a different kind of civilization was already thriving, quietly, gracefully, on the dry, windswept coast of Peru. It did not announce itself with swords or empires. It left no stories of conquest, no murals of war. And for nearly 5,000 years, no one even knew it had existed. That city was Caral. Tucked deep in the Soup Valley, an arid stretch of desert where the land seems too dry to breathe, Caral rose like a whisper from the earth. At first glance, the setting seems impossible. Parched soil. Scorching sun. A thin river winding through cracked rock. It looks like a place where life gives up. But the people of Caral saw something different. They didn't see a wasteland. They saw potential. They studied the land. Watched the river. Understood the rhythm of wind, water, and sky. And where others saw dust, they imagined cities. Caral was not a village of scattered huts. It was a city of vision, planned, ordered, and grand. It stretched over 150 acres and was filled with monumental pyramids, ceremonial plazas, administrative spaces, and residential zones. It was not random. It was deliberate. It was civilization with purpose. And what makes it even more astonishing? Caral did this without writing. Without wheels. Without metal tools. They built it all using stone, earth, plant fiber, and human ingenuity. The people of Carol lived in a time when most humans on Earth still hunted and gathered. And yet here, in one of the harshest places imaginable, they raised pyramids. Created trade networks. Designed a society that would rival even the greatest empires, centuries before those empires came to be. But how did Carol remain hidden for so long? For centuries, travelers stumbled across strange, rounded hills in the Soup Valley. They thought they were natural formations, just wind-blown dunes. The desert had covered everything. Its silence, perfect. Its disguise, flawless. It wasn't until the late 20th century that a determined Peruvian archaeologist, Ruth Shady, decided to dig deeper. She believed those mounds were not hills, but ruins. And she was right. Layer by layer, her team peeled back the sand. And what emerged stunned the world. Stone walls. Staircases. Sunken plazas. Pyramids. A city. Carbon dating would confirm the unbelievable. Carol was over 4,600 years old, built at the same time as the earliest cities of Mesopotamia and the Nile. And yet, no one had ever known. Carol didn't just rewrite a chapter in the story of the Americas. It rewrote the prologue. This wasn't a marginal tribe clinging to survival. This was a thriving society, full of art, science, trade, and faith. A culture that had chosen not violence, but harmony. Carol's architecture was sophisticated. Buildings were aligned with the stars. Circular sunken plazas may have served as amphitheaters for rituals or seasonal ceremonies. Their placement was no accident. They were designed for sound, for vision, for celestial tracking. These weren't just spaces. They were instruments, tools to understand the universe. And perhaps most remarkably of all, no weapons were found. No signs of war. No defensive walls. No burned buildings. Carol, it seems, did not rise through conquest. It rose through community. The people farmed cotton, sweet potatoes, beans, and guava. They crafted fishing nets from plant fibers and traded them for dried fish with coastal neighbors. In return, they received precious shells, stones from the Andes, and even exotic fruits. Carol was a hub. Not of armies, but of ideas. This was a society rooted in balance, with the land, with the stars, and with each other. And then, it vanished. Not in fire. Not in blood. But quietly. Gradually. The plazas emptied. The music stopped. The sand crept in. For nearly 4,000 years, Carol slept beneath the desert. Waiting. Until now. Today, walking through the ruins, it's hard not to feel it. That this place mattered. That its silence carries meaning. Carol teaches us something simple, but profound. That civilization doesn't need violence to grow. That greatness can be measured not in swords, but in ideas. And perhaps, in the quiet dreams of people who dared to plant a city where nothing should grow. It wasn't a city of conquest. It didn't rise behind walls, guarded by spears and soaked in blood. Carol rose from something rarer, trust. From its very foundations, Carol was built not for war, but for life. There were no battlements. No watchtowers. No signs of siege or conflict. The pyramids didn't house kings or generals, and the plazas weren't platforms for executions. Instead, they were designed for people to gather, to celebrate, to worship, and to dream. Its architecture was visionary. Massive pyramids made of stone and earth loomed above sunken plazas, not as fortresses, but as sacred mountains, bridges between earth and sky. These platforms once echoed with music and ceremony, not the clash of arms. The city itself was a marvel of design. Major structures aligned with celestial events, solstices, sunrises, star movements. They weren't just builders. They were astronomers. Philosophers. Artists of time and space. And remarkably, all of it, Every wall, stair, plaza, was constructed without metal tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden. Stones were carried in reed bags. Earth was moved with woven baskets. It was raw human effort, coordinated through social organization and collective will. A community not only skilled, but deeply united. And in this unity, music played a powerful role. Among the artifacts unearthed were flutes made from condor bones, drums crafted from deer hides, whistles carved from pelican beaks. These weren't toys. They were tuned. Designed to echo through the plazas, to reach every soul standing under the open desert sky. Carol wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a city that sang. Every public space was an instrument. The sunken plazas. Ancient amphitheaters. They focused sound like bowls, allowing the hum of flutes and chants to rise, spiral, and fall in harmony with the wind. When you walk those ruins today, you can almost hear it. The beat of feet stamping to the rhythm of harvest festivals. The low pulse of drums calling down the stars. The soft rise of songs offered to the gods of river, sky, and sun. It was a spiritual city, but not one built on fear. No murals of war. No blood sacrifices. No temples to angry gods demanding conquest. Instead, Carol's spiritual world seems to have centered on balance, observation, and respect, for nature, for time, for each other. Even Carol's engineering reflected this harmony. They lived in a seismic zone, prone to violent earthquakes. But their buildings endured. How? They mastered quake-resistant design. Broad foundations. Layered fills. Rounded corners that absorbed tremors rather than cracked under them. This was wisdom, not from books, but from living with the earth, understanding its moods, and responding with grace. Their irrigation system tells the same story. In a desert with so little water, they wasted nothing. Canals channeled the river precisely. Fields thrived on carefully measured irrigation. Every drop was sacred. Every season, anticipated. Their city layout wasn't random. Ceremonial spaces stood at the heart. Administrative areas radiated outward. Residential zones surrounded all of it, woven like rings around a spiritual core. This wasn't just architecture. This was a philosophy made of stone. Trade, too, was a form of peace. Carol didn't dominate its neighbors. It connected with them. It became a hub for commerce and culture, exchanging cotton for fish, produce for exotic shells and stones. It bound communities not through conquest, but through cooperation. And through it all, Carol endured, for centuries. Not because it was the strongest. But because it was balanced. Because its people believed that you didn't have to rule with a sword to leave behind something eternal. Their legacy wasn't carved in victory. It was woven into music. Built into plazas. Etched in the alignment of pyramids with the stars. And 5,000 years later, their stones still stand, not shouting, but whispering. There is another way. For centuries, Carol sang. Its plazas echoed with music, laughter, trade, and ceremony. Its pyramids stood watch over a thriving people who had mastered the art of living with harmony, in one of Earth's most hostile landscapes. And then, almost without warning, it was gone. No war. No fire. No crumbling towers or fallen gates. Just silence. The city that once pulsed with life fell quiet. Its plazas emptied. Its flutes and drums hushed by time. The sand, slow and patient, returned to reclaim what had been borrowed from the earth. Why? That is the question that haunts every archaeologist, every visitor, every soul who walks the ruins of Carol today. Theories abound. But none are certain. Some scholars believe the end came with the sky. Drought. Long, punishing, relentless drought. The Soup River, lifeblood of the valley, may have slowed to a trickle. Crops failed. Irrigation systems dried. And without water, the delicate balance Carol had struck with nature finally tipped too far. No food meant no trade. No trade meant no power. Without surplus cotton, guava, and fish to exchange, Carol's influence may have crumbled. A city built on cooperation could no longer sustain its web of peaceful connection. Others suggest the cause came from beyond. As neighboring societies grew, trade routes shifted. New centers of power emerged along the coast and in the Andes. The world around Carol was changing. What once made Carol valuable, its textiles, dried fish, astronomical wisdom, might have slowly lost relevance. The networks that once stitched the region together now pulled in different directions. And Carol, once the center, became the edge. Still others point to internal decline. Without written records, much remains mystery. But perhaps even a peaceful society is not immune to fatigue. Leadership may have weakened. Spiritual unity may have frayed. Maybe the very harmony that once bound Carol together began to dissolve when survival became uncertain. No mass graves. No signs of violence. No sudden catastrophe. Just a quiet unraveling. One family leaving for greener valleys. Then another. And another. Until Carol was no longer a city, but a memory scattered on the wind. Children who once ran across its plazas may have grown up telling stories of the old place, where the stars aligned and the pyramids touched the sky. And those stories, over time, faded into legend. For nearly 4,000 years, Carol slept beneath the sand. Its stone walls hidden. Its plazas forgotten. Its instruments silenced. And then, in the late 20th century, its voice returned. Rediscovered by Ruth Shady and her team, Carol rose once more, not as a living city, but as a whisper from the past. Its pyramids still stood. Its plazas still curved like ancient ears, waiting to hear again. Its instruments, flutes, drums, and whistles, still cradled in the earth, untouched by violence, untouched by fire. This was no ordinary city. And this was no ordinary ending. Carol did not fall. It withdrew. Like the tide retreating from the shore. Like a song reaching its final note. What it left behind was not ruin, but revelation. A civilization that proved the greatest achievements of humanity, art, architecture, astronomy, music, did not need to be built on the bones of conquest. That knowledge, community, and belief could raise a city as enduring as any empire. And even in disappearance, Carol endured. Today, we walk among its ruins with reverence. We study its pyramids. We listen to the desert wind and wonder how much we've forgotten, and how much we still might learn. The story of Carol didn't end in tragedy. It ended in silence. And sometimes, silence says more than 1,000 fallen empires ever could. 5,000 years ago, in a desert that should have swallowed all dreams, the people of Carol built something eternal. They didn't do it with empires or armies. They did it with harmony, ingenuity, and trust. Today, as archaeologists carefully brush away the sand from pyramid steps and sunken plazas, Carol isn't just revealing stones, it's revealing a story. One that modern society desperately needs to hear. Carol wasn't built on war. It wasn't defined by conquest. There are no blood-stained murals here. No towering statues of kings wielding weapons. Instead, what Carol offers us is something far more revolutionary, proof that peace can build greatness. In a world that often celebrates dominance, Carol whispers a different truth. A truth that says collaboration matters more than control. That wisdom can rise higher than walls. That you don't need to conquer others to shape history, you just need to understand the land, the stars, and one another. Its pyramids weren't tombs. They were temples of connection. Its plazas weren't arenas of power. They were gathering grounds of unity. And perhaps what's most humbling is this: they did it all without writing a single word. No scrolls. No records. No epics carved in stone. And yet, we understand them. Because their story isn't written in ink, it's written in design, in music, in the way their city breathes with intention. Their knowledge of astronomy, of engineering, of social organization, these weren't accidents. These were the results of generations observing, learning, and passing wisdom through ritual, rhythm, and relationship. In the 21st century, Carol stands as both a wonder of the ancient world and a mirror for our own. Where they aligned buildings with the solstice, we build glass towers that reflect only ourselves. Where they built for centuries of harmony, we often build for quarterly profit. But maybe, just maybe, Carol is not a monument to the past. It's a blueprint for the future. A city that teaches us that peace is not the absence of ambition. It is ambition of the highest order. Peace that builds pyramids. Peace that connects communities. Peace that survives millennia of wind and silence and still speaks clearly, across time. It took nearly 5,000 years for the world to rediscover Carol. For centuries, it slept under dust, ignored by maps and overlooked by history books. And now, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A beacon in the desert. A reminder. A reminder that civilization does not begin with domination, but with vision. That true innovation begins when we choose cooperation over conquest. That the greatest cities may not be the loudest or the richest, but the ones that leave no scars behind. Carol's legacy humbles us. It tells us that even in a world without iron or wheels, without written law or armies, human beings were capable of extraordinary harmony. They mapped the stars. They moved mountains of stone. They created music that still resonates in bone flutes unearthed beneath the sand. And they did it all while choosing to live without violence. It's not just remarkable. It's radical. In a world that teaches us to fight for everything, to defend, to dominate, to divide, Carol whispers a deeper truth. You don't have to raise a sword to raise a civilization. You just need to raise each other. So now, when we walk through the ruins of Carol, we're not just walking through history. We're walking through possibility. Through what could be, if we listened more. If we built together. If we honored the earth and each other the way Carol once did. Its pyramids don't just stand for what was. They stand for what still can be. It's easy to stand among the ruins of Carol and be awestruck by the size of its pyramids, the elegance of its plazas, and the symmetry of its design. But what truly sets Carol apart is not just what they built, but how they built it. And more importantly, why. In a land where the earth shakes without warning, where water is a precious and unpredictable gift, and where resources are few and hard-won, the people of Carol achieved engineering marvels that even today defy expectations. Start with the earth. Carol sits in a seismic zone, an area known for frequent and sometimes violent earthquakes. Most ancient cities built without reinforced materials would crumble. But Carol didn't. It stood strong. For millennia. Why? Because the builders of Carol understood the land. Their architecture didn't fight nature, it worked with it. They used wide foundations to distribute weight. They layered materials, stone, gravel, and fill, in ways that absorbed tremors like a cushion. And perhaps most ingeniously, they rounded corners and avoided sharp angles, allowing energy from the earth to ripple through without causing collapse. This was earthquake-resistant design. 5,000 years ago. And they had no metal tools. No wheels. No animals to carry stone. They used woven reed bags to haul rocks. They shaped stone with stone. They didn't rely on brute force, they relied on collaboration, knowledge, and patience. Now shift your eyes to the sky. Carol wasn't just practical. It was cosmic. Its layout shows clear alignment with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the movements of stars. The city's major structures, its pyramids, plazas, and platforms, were designed not just for function, but for meaning. They were tools of observation. The sunken circular courts acted like ancient observatories. Priests and astronomers could track the passage of seasons, predict when to plant, when to harvest, when to call the people together for rituals. In a world without calendars or written charts, Carol looked to the sky for order, and found it. Their knowledge of astronomy wasn't abstract, it was survival. The stars told them when the river might rise. The sun told them when crops could grow. The heavens shaped life on earth. And this understanding was embedded into their city's very bones. It's one thing to build for shelter. It's another to build for the cosmos. Now, return to the ground and think about water. Carol's desert climate should have made agriculture nearly impossible. But Carol flourished with green life. Sweet potatoes. Squash. Beans. Cotton. Why? Because they mastered irrigation. They carved canals with stone tools. They managed every drop of river water with care. Nothing was wasted. Their fields thrived in a place where other societies might have starved. Because the people of Carol planned ahead, studied the flow of water, built systems to guide it, preserve it, and share it. Their irrigation wasn't just efficient, it was ethical. Water was life. And in Carol, life was shared. And then there's the city itself. Carol wasn't a sprawl of random huts. It was a blueprint. Ceremonial centers sat at its core, anchoring spiritual life. Administrative buildings organized governance. Residential zones fanned out with order and purpose. Even the distances between structures seemed intentional, balancing light, shadow, wind, and sound. And sound mattered. Music was woven into the architecture. The plazas were designed to carry the sound of flutes, drums, and chants across great distances. This was a society that thought not just of what people needed, but how they felt. Their city wasn't just functional, it was emotional. Every plaza, every stairway, every pyramid, was part of a living song. A harmony of engineering, culture, and community. Modern engineers today visit Carol and marvel. How did they do this without machines? Without steel? Without blueprints? The answer isn't just in their tools. It's in their values. Carol was built by people who believed that wisdom comes from listening to the earth. That progress doesn't mean conquering nature, but understanding it. That the best civilizations are those that leave the fewest scars. That might be the most advanced engineering of all. Carol doesn't roar from the past like an empire built on war. It doesn't tower with pride like cities shaped by conquest. It whispers. And in that whisper lies a truth the modern world still struggles to hear. Carol was not perfect. It didn't last forever. But it lasted long enough to leave behind a blueprint. Not just of how to build, but how to live. In a time when most societies defined greatness by how many enemies they could crush, Carol defined greatness by how many people they could gather, how many ideas they could share, how long they could thrive without violence. And thrive they did. For nearly 1,000 years. They built pyramids without armies. They traded across vast distances without conquest. They organized public life without written laws. They aligned their buildings with the stars without telescopes. They listened to the wind, the river, the earth, and responded with cooperation, not domination. What does Carol teach us? First, that peace is possible, even in the harshest conditions. Carol wasn't built in a paradise. It was born in a desert. Where others saw dry, dead land, the Carol people saw a challenge, and an opportunity. They didn't fight the desert. They learned from it. They studied its seasons, mapped its patterns, and turned it into a partner. They proved that peace isn't what happens when life is easy. Peace is what you choose, especially when it's hard. Second, that music, art, and ritual aren't luxuries. They're the foundation of human connection. In Carol, music wasn't entertainment. It was a bridge. Flutes made from condor bones. Drums stretched with deer hide. These were the voices of a people who chose harmony over hierarchy. Their plazas weren't just places to gather. They were designed to echo sound, to carry emotion, belief, and shared meaning across generations. Third, that intelligence can take many forms. Carol didn't have the wheel. They didn't write in books. But they built quake-resistant pyramids, complex irrigation systems, and astronomically aligned cities. All with stone, sweat, and song. What does that tell us? That technology isn't the only kind of intelligence. Sometimes, wisdom is born not from invention, but from observation. From respect. From humility in the face of nature. Fourth, that civilization doesn't require violence. This may be Carol's most radical lesson. No weapons have been found. No fortresses. No mass graves. In an ancient world defined by bloodshed, Carol chose another way. They didn't dominate. They connected. They didn't conquer. They collaborated. They didn't rise through destruction. They rose through design. And finally, that even when a civilization falls, its spirit can remain. Carol was buried in silence for thousands of years. But it didn't disappear. Its stones endured. Its stories waited. And now, as we uncover its plazas, trace its staircases, and hold its ancient instruments in our hands, we hear that whisper again. There is another path. One that does not break the world to leave a mark on it. One that builds not to boast, but to belong. One that remembers that human greatness lies not in how high we can stack stones, but in how well we can live together beneath them. Today, Carol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Not just because it's old. Not just because it's beautiful. But because it reminds us of something we forgot. That civilization began, not with domination, but with hope. And it can still be built, not with fear, but with trust. When we look at Carol now, we don't just see what was. We see what still could be.